You're listening to Systemic Error Podcast. The failure was designed.
Trump is trying to imprison Americans for joining internet chats he doesn't like, based on an article by Jordan Green, investigative reporter. The state is prosecuting association, not violence, power, not confusion. The source is simple enough. The Trump administration unsealed a 94-page indictment against 15 anti-ICE activists in Minnesota, and much of it turns on meetings, signal chats, public organizing, and protest activity. One defendant is alleged to have carried a homemade shield and coordinated marshals. Another is mostly described as being in chats. No officer injury is alleged in the conspiracy count. That matters, because the government is not chasing a violent assault case here. It is building a political case around dissent. The real decision makers, the people with actual institutional power, are obvious. The Trump White House set the target through NSBM 7. Federal prosecutors translated that directive into an indictment. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche dressed it up as law and order. White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson supplied the propaganda vocabulary about left-wing violence. This is not a spontaneous law enforcement response to a public safety emergency. It is a top-down decision to redefine opposition as criminality. The defendants did not create that asymmetry. They responded to ICE operations in Minneapolis. The state chose escalation, signal chats as a pretext. The indictment's reliance on signal groups is not incidental. It is the point. Prosecutors are trying to turn ordinary movement infrastructure into evidence of conspiracy. Meetings become suspect. Marshals become militant. Public observation becomes harassment. Speech is recast as criminal intent. That framing is not neutral error. It is misdirection. It takes the least coercive forms of political action available to ordinary people and tries to launder them into organized political violence. The record described in the source is full of organizing, monitoring, and protest. What it is not full of is a clear allegation of federal officer injury. The gap between those two facts is the whole case. Retaliation after defeat. The defense is correct to call this political. Bruce Nestor says the charges came months after the federal forces were forced to retreat by the people of Minnesota. That is the useful lens. When the state loses on the ground, it often returns through the courtroom. The indictment reads like retaliation against a successful resistance network. Isaac Sant says the government is trying to scare people out of dissent by making ordinary organizing feel prosecutable. That is exactly how chilling effects work, not by banning everything outright, but by making the cost of association unpredictable enough to discourage participation. ICE cannot be humanized into legitimacy. The story also exposes the obscene normality of ICE itself. The federal operation at issue is not some misunderstood bureaucracy. It is an enforcement machine built to seize, deter, and terrorize vulnerable people. The activists were trying to obstruct that machine. The government's response is to criminalize the obstruction instead of confronting the violence of the underlying system. That is why this cannot be reduced to a debate about tactics, training, or oversight. ICE should be abolished. A state that depends on immigration terror will always call resistance extremism when that resistance becomes effective. The larger pattern. The broader pattern is authoritarian inversion. Power commits coercion, then brands opposition as danger. It targets networks, chats, and meetings because those are the connective tissue of democratic resistance. It invokes domestic terrorism language not to clarify harm, but to blur the line between violence and civic solidarity. The lesson is not that the state is confused. The lesson is that it knows exactly what it is doing. It is trying to make organizing itself feel illegal. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Raw Story for today's article, with the automated voice of Joe. Thanks for listening.